All right, let's talk about the 1918 influenza pandemic. So one of the first things that you need to know is that the 1918 pandemic was what a lot of people consider to be one of the first truly global pandemics, right? The word pandemic itself meaning a disease that kind of has like a widespread impact on people across the globe. Now, if you're thinking about previous major diseases, you may have heard of something like called the Black Death or the bubonic plague, which ravaged Europe during the Middle Ages. And that was a horrible disease and had a huge impact, killing maybe a third of all the people that lived in Europe at the time of the disease, right? But the scary thing about the influenza pandemic of 1918 is that it spread so quickly across the entire planet, and if it hadn't gotten stopped, could have had even more of a devastating effect, right? The lowest estimate on the death toll was 20 million people. The average, the one that most people agree, is that it killed at least 50 million people. And on the high end, some people believe it could have killed all the way up to 100 million people, which is a lot of people. That's, if you think about it, that's almost a third of all Americans, right? So if you killed 1 out of every 3 Americans, that's how many people we're talking about died in this kind of disease over this relatively short period of time. We're really looking at like late 1917 to 1919 that this kind of swept the globe. Now, you're probably asking yourself, how could the estimate be all the way from 20 to 100 million? Well, part of the reason why we don't have better statistics is there wasn't a better way of taking statistics back then. We didn't have computers. We didn't have Google Drives to share information with each other on, right? There was a lot of rural areas in the world back then. Even major cities didn't have the same kinds of technology that we do now to be able to track it. So it was definitely hard to say. Another reason why it was difficult to say how many people died is a lot of countries intentionally didn't report as many cases as were actually happening. There's a lot of reasons for that, okay? The first reason why a lot of people didn't report how many cases there were is there was a war going on, right? The World War I kind of kicked off for America anyway in 1917, right? We first started sending troops, right, in late 1917, right? The U.S. was starting to show signs of the influenza disease back in 1917, but no one really wanted to talk about it because we didn't want to seem weak going into a war, right? A lot of countries didn't want to seem weak. They didn't want their enemies to know that they were being crippled by this disease, so they kept quiet about it, right? They wanted to show strength rather than actually work on being strong, right? And as a result, more people died of influenza than died in all of World War I. That's worth repeating, so I will. More people died of the Spanish flu than died in World War I altogether, right? An armed conflict. Part of the reason why it's called the Spanish flu is during World War I, Spain was one of the few countries that wasn't fighting. And so they were willing to report it. They said, hey, there's a problem here. We're getting sick and we need to do something about it. And so that's why it kind of has that name till this day. It's not because it started in Spain, and it's not because that only Spanish people got it. It's just called the Spanish flu because they were the ones that were the first to be brave enough to say, hey, we have a problem, we're trying to do something about it. And the name has kind of stuck, at least here in America, ever since. Okay? Another reason why it was underreported, a lot of that has to do with, again, testing, right? They didn't have the ability to take the test. Now, by 1918, there was some type of modern medicine, right? It's very different than what we know now. And a lot of the advances, though, had identified things that could kill people, but most of them were bacteria. Now, bacteria are itty-bitty, tiny, one-celled organisms that you probably could learn about with Ms. B way better than you could learn about from me. But bacteria are living things. They're like proto-plants almost, right? Like they're like a single-cell living organism. Viruses were very, very, very new for understanding back in 1918. And they didn't really understand what a virus was in the same way that we do now, right? And so just kind of as like I'm going to give you some stats right now. The Spanish flu, I'm going to start calling it what it is. It's a strain of influenza called H1N1. Now, you may have heard of H1N1. It's also referred to as the avian flu or bird flu. And it was a big deal probably within your lifetimes, right? And so you may not have heard of it though, because I mean, who like studies like random history things, okay?
Hey there, sorry big guy, but could you pause for just 1 second? Because I forgot to mention. Okay, so part of the reason why it's called avian flu or bird flu is sometimes diseases can hop from species to species, right? So H1N1 is one of those examples, right? Where it's believed that it comes from birds, right? And it can either sometimes mutate itself when it's replicating and jump to another species like pigs, and then we eat the pigs and then we become sick, or sometimes it can mutate and then just hop straight from birds to us. I thought that was important for you to know because, again, naming things matter, so that's the reason why. Okay, you take it away, big guy.
Viruses, the way that they work, okay, viruses are just kind of floating strands of genetic material. And the only thing they're good at doing is taking over cells and getting their genetic material, the cell's genetic material, to replicate the virus's genetic material, right? So it's either RNA or DNA. And all they're doing is they take over your cell's nucleus and they just start churning out more viruses, right? And then a lot of the times your cell bursts and those viruses spread to new cells and they continue to perpetuate that way until there's an army of cells in your body. You start coughing or sneezing or touching your eyeballs and then touching surfaces or licking things and touching things. And that's how diseases spread, because it has now moved on into your saliva, into the fluids that are produced by your body.
Sorry. Pause one more time. One of the things that's important to know is that the reason why the flu can be so deadly is because what the flu does is it weakens your respiratory system, right? Your lungs, your esophagus, right? When you're breathing, right, your lung needs to get air to the rest of your body, right? The oxygen that you're getting from breathing goes to your red blood cells, and that oxygen helps actually create energy all over your body. If your body's not getting oxygen, it slowly starts to die. Have you ever sat in a weird way and your foot falls asleep? That's because it's not getting enough oxygen. If you were to block it off entirely from blood, eventually the cells would start to die. The way that sometimes flus get you is by weakening your your respiratory system, to the point where you start to actually get another disease, like a secondary disease, like bacterial pneumonia, where fluid starts to fill up in your lungs, and then you can't get that oxygen. And ultimately what happens is your organs start to die, right? Your kidneys, your liver, right? Things that you need stop getting enough oxygen and you die. H1N1 was particularly bad. They called it the Blue Death because people weren't getting enough oxygen and literally turning blue. It was painful, right? Their eyes ached, your body ached, you became weak, you became fatigued, right? In some cases, people actually had perforations, little itty bitty teeny tiny holes in their lungs where air would seep out, and then when they would move you, you would crack because you could hear the popping of the air bubbles inside of you. Yeah, creepy, yo. Sorry, take it away, big guy.
Right? So what ended up happening, right, is that this disease, right, this virus started to pop up in different places around the world, right? There's some speculation that it started in China, but we know that in late 1917, it started popping up in US military bases, right? Now, military bases are designed to store thousands of people, right, in relatively small quarters where they're sharing communal living spaces. They live in open barracks, right? They share food in cafeterias, right? So this is like the sweet spot for viruses, right? Viruses are like, yay, military bases! And people were starting to get sick. But the U.S. military, being the super strong, tried and true, we're going to do or die, started shipping some of these sick men on boats, right, to go to fight the war in Europe, okay? Now, what's the problem with being trapped on a boat for like a week? Again, super tight spaces. So if one person was sick, they were spreading this disease to several other people, okay? When the disease finally makes it to Europe, it totally spreads and starts causing some serious problems. By the end of the pandemic, right, 675,000 Americans die from it, right? And it came in 3 waves, right? The first main wave was in 1918, and then you have 2 waves coming after it, right? One in 1918 and then one in 1919. The second wave was actually the most deadly for Americans, right? And that's one of the things to think about, is that the way that viruses tend to work is that when they bubble up, people get sick, right? They pass it to other people, but if you survive the illness, you start to build up something called immunity, right? You have cells in your body that are designed to fight off viruses, and the way that they learn to fight them off is fighting them off one time. If they can beat them one time, they understand how to do it from that point forward. The problem with this is if you don't get it, right, in the first wave, you're susceptible to getting it in a second or a third wave. This is why it's important to have something called herd immunity, right? You may not have got it, but if enough people around you get it and survive it, you don't necessarily need to have immunity, but no one had developed this, right? And so the world kept getting hit wave after wave, right? They weren't able to create a good vaccine early enough to save a lot of people's lives. Now, one of the things that happened as this started to move across America and the world is lots of different places decided to try to address it differently. But one of the main things that people started to do was start to say, we need to socially distance, right? We need to separate ourselves. So businesses began to close early. People were instructed to, cover their faces, and people were instructed, if they were to cough, to kind of cover it. They understood these basics, but they didn't do as much as maybe we're doing now with the coronavirus, right? Businesses maybe were asked to close a little bit early, an hour or 2 early a day, right? Some cities made laws where it was illegal to spit on the ground, but then other places took it to the extreme, right? There were cases where some cities killed all the stray dogs because they were afraid that it was being carried in that way. All right, so we're going to look at the stories of 2 different cities to help us kind of understand the American response to H1N1, all right? So the first city that we're going to look at is Charlotte, okay? During the 1918 pandemic, Charlotte was a pretty big American city, right? It's not as big as Charlotte is today, and it's definitely not as big as LA is. But when we're thinking about it, it was still a city that had businesses from all around the country coming through to do business, and then people from around the world were coming to Charlotte. Now, Charlotte knew of its reputation as being one of the biggest cities in the area, so when the 1918 pandemic hit, they didn't want people to get scared. So rather than rally the people around the truth and the facts of the matter, they tried to suppress it. And as people started to die, they pretended that it wasn't as big of a deal. Local newspapers didn't report accurate numbers. Local politicians didn't make a big enough deal of it. And what ended up happening is, ultimately, hundreds of people died in Charlotte. On the flip side, you had a city like Gunnison, Colorado, right? And in Gunnison County, what actually happened is, as the disease began to spread throughout America, Gunnison said, we're gonna shut it all down. And they actually went to the extreme. They built fences and barbed wire kind of railing and shut down some train stations and made sure that no one came into their small town. I mean, there were only 1,300 people that lived in Gunnison at the time, and they had 2 railroads that went through it, and so they didn't want the disease passing through and ravaging their community. And what happened is, during the first portions of the 3rd wave, no one got sick. Ultimately, in Gunnison, 100 people did end up getting sick, but none of them died. And part of that was because they made sure that they were on top of it from the beginning, okay?